Hello. In today's lecture, we will discuss the cultural relativist challenge to universal human rights. In particular, we'll revisit the basic idea that if an individual possesses rights simply because she or he is a human being, it logically follows that these rights are held universally by all humans. Now, you might wonder why this would be the subject of a challenge, but the devil is in the details, I suppose. And although at the time of the adoption of the UN Charter and the UDHR in 1948, the idea of universal human rights was widely accepted, challenges and difficulties arose once the abstract idea of recognizing individual human rights was translated or operationalized in international rules and international institutions. And this occurred both during the Cold War in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, as well as after the Cold War during the last 2 decades. Now, before proceeding, I'd like to say that this is a very large topic that could be examined from the perspective of philosophy, politics, and other vantage points. We'll be looking at the legal issues as they evolved over the last several decades. First, let's talk about cultural relativism during the Cold War. So, during that period, starting in the late 1940s and continuing for the next 40 or so years, there were disputes primarily between democracies and socialist countries over the different categories of rights that appear in the Universal Declaration: economic and social rights on the one hand, and civil and political rights on the other. If you recall our discussion from a previous lecture, we saw that both of these categories of rights appear in the Universal Declaration. But as we will discuss in considerable detail in the second week of the course, when the time came to translate the Universal Declaration into 2 legally binding treaties, or covenants in this case, the decision was made to split those instruments into separate legal agreements. Now, what's the significance of that separation, and how does it relate to the challenge of cultural relativism? Well, formally, these 2 treaties are occupy the same status. They are both legally binding agreements for those nation states that have ratified them. However, as we will see, each covenant contains different legal standards with different degrees of particularity and precision, and also different implementation mechanisms. And this created contestation over whether the 2 sets of human rights were equal, or whether there was either an explicit or implicit hierarchy of rights, with one being higher than the other. This related to issues of the Cold War because, on the whole, socialist countries were rather good at protecting economic and social rights, but had a much poorer track record on civil and political rights, whereas democracies had an excellent track record, on the whole, on civil and political rights, but not such a good record of adherence to economic and social rights. The terms of the debate with regard to universality of human rights and cultural relativism shifted after the Cold War in a number of respects. It would be fair to say that there are 2 types of critiques post-Cold War. The first is directed at the idea of human rights in general. According to this broad critique, different societies, cultures, and religions hold different kinds of moral beliefs, including in particular about rights. And further, the international legal system that protects human rights and the human rights themselves are Western constructs, and therefore it follows that it's unjustifiable to criticize states that violate human rights. Now, this is the strongest form of the cultural relativist critique, and it is probably the least persuasive precisely because it is so strong. There is, however, a different, narrower version that has a bit more persuasive value, and that is a society-specific critique of human rights. Under this approach, a society would accept the legitimacy of certain human rights that it recognizes as being fundamental, but it would reject as inconsistent with its culture, religion, or other important values other categories of rights. An easy example would be a recognition of the right to life and the prohibition of torture, but a non-recognition of freedom of expression. Now, this is still quite controversial because it takes the position that certain rights can be culturally determined or society-specific, while others are universal in scope. This idea came to a head, if you will, in the early 1990s, and the challenge was led by a group of Asian countries, China in particular, which made, I would say, a fairly strong version of the cultural relativist critique. These countries argued that human rights is not a universal concept, but rather is culturally determined, and in part as a result, interferences with the domestic affairs of another state in the name of protecting human rights would be inconsistent with state sovereignty. And again, sovereignty is that international legal principle that was discussed in the second lecture this week. So what was the response to this challenge? And this challenge now backed up by a number of very important and influential countries. Well, first, it's worth noting that the Asian countries put on paper their objections. And they did so in the form of a non-binding declaration, a form of soft law, the kind of norm that we mentioned in the previous lecture, in which they set out the justifications for this challenge. And you see the key quote from the Bangkok Declaration of 1993 before you, and it's a bit of a mix if you look at it carefully. It says, while human rights are universal in nature, they have to be considered, and I would say that would mean applied or interpreted in the context of a dynamic and an evolutionary process that bears in mind the importance of national and regional particularities, meaning special or local circumstances, and various historical, cultural, and religious backgrounds. Now, as stated, this argument raises a number of challenges to the universal nature of human rights. And in part, due to those challenges and to a desire to develop a common baseline for moving forward at this period just after the end of the Cold War, the nation states of the world came together at a meeting also in 1993, a couple of months later, the World Conference on Human Rights. And at that conference, there were discussions and debates around a variety of human rights issues, including in particular the relationship between universal rights and cultural specificities or particularities. And at the conclusion of this conference in Vienna, Austria, the member states of the United Nations unanimously adopted the Vienna Declaration and Program of Action. And the key clause from that declaration is the first paragraph, in which the states reaffirm their commitment to the promotion of universal respect for and observance and protection of all human rights and fundamental freedoms in accordance with the UN Charter, but not just the UN Charter, also other instruments or other legal agreements, that would be, relating to human rights and international law. And I've highlighted the concluding section to show you that that's a quite strong rejoinder, I would say, to the cultural relativist critique. And that final sentence says that the universal nature of these rights and freedoms is beyond question. Now, this document purports to be a fairly definitive final word on the cultural relativist challenge. As we will see, however, it was an important document at a level of fairly high generality at a conceptual level, but the idea of whether human rights norms ought to be tailored to different national, legal, social, and political circumstances, and if so, how and to what degree they ought to be tailored, is an ongoing concern. And that's one that we will begin to discuss in detail next week when we turn to the specific discussion of civil and political rights, women's rights, and economic, social, and cultural rights. I'll conclude by providing you with some additional sources in case you are interested in researching further the cultural relativist challenge to international human rights. I look forward to seeing you next week.